All right. So thank you all. As I said in that introduction, this is we're doing a day of kind of showcase, not just for you guys, but also for a wider audience. So switch off if you want for a while. So my name is Keith Brown. I'm one of the instructors for the current class, Building a Better World, Film and Social Change, along with Provost Richard Locke and filmmaker Lindsay Richardson. Rick Locke sends his regrets. He was unable to be here today, and neither he nor Lindsay Richardson, who it turns out is the person in this room I've known the longest, which I hadn't realized before, neither of them approved this message. So I'm going to take advantage of this moment before acknowledging the people who made this possible and introducing our keynote speaker, Brian Palmer, to be a little self-indulgent. So this is one of those moments where the different communities that have been living inside my head together for a long time actually come into contact in the real world, and hopefully productive conversation extends far beyond this room. So for anyone who is here and coming to this conversation for the very first time, including anyone who might be watching because we are streaming this online, welcome to you. This is a public event. We have 3 components: Brian's keynote, 2 panels with recent alumni working in documentary film who will share some of their work and their perspectives on it. And in the middle of all that, there's lunch in the Kim Koo Library at 1 p.m. in this building, and everyone is invited to that lunch. So some of you are, I know, are ambitious dreamers, grappling with the big questions of our time: inequality, climate change, workers' rights, racial justice, and the costs of war. And I'm in awe of ambitious dreamers, as well as the researchers who diagnose the roots of those pressing global problems and come up with ways to address them. And that's what the Watson Institute, where we are, is all about. I've been here 15 years now, though, and I've come to realize the limits of the heroic individualism that we all fall prey to, of imagining that any of us can do that, that is, diagnose the roots of pressing global problems and address them. It's heroic individualism to imagine we can do that effectively on our own and all at once. So this workshop was part of a longer-term effort to foster collaboration and the sharing of expertise and knowledge in the service of building a better world. I think policy analysis, storytelling, and teamwork are all important, and I think we can do them better, obviously, when we do them together over the long haul with some commitment to pooling our resources and transferring our knowledge. So passing the baton, if you like, is a metaphor for what I'm imagining goes on all the time and could go on more. Conversation is part of that, and so is writing, but I think especially storytelling through images is key to it. So that's what this class and this workshop are about. It's the service of this larger purpose to create the opportunity for students at Brown to develop data fluency and visual literacy in parallel, as well as robust habits of effective collaboration, which I know some of you are already enjoying. And I also, this workshop is to give space to former students who have put those skills to use already in the world to come back and showcase their work. So depending on how you count, today is 2 months, or 3 years, or 8 years, or perhaps 14 years in the making. So 35 of you, if you're all here, and you better be, I met 2 months ago when you signed up for what you thought was one class. Some of you I met in 2012 when Lindsay and I offered, again, 2 classes in one. And Jonah David worked tirelessly as the TA for that class, who's here today, and Emily Cassie took that class. In 2008, I had the good fortune to be assigned Sabrina Scow as a first-year advisee. And watched the way she crafted a filmmaking career out of her concentration at Brown. And then some folks here I met in 2007 when I taught documentary work and social change with documentary filmmaker Deborah Scranton. And we hosted a workshop. For anyone who's been in my office and believes I can't find things, here is the poster from the 2007 event. And that workshop was sort of a prelude to this. It was designed specifically for the class. So Bremen Donovan was in that class and came to the entire workshop. Finn Yarborough was in the class, and it turns out didn't come to the entire workshop, but managed to evade by noticing that. And that's where I met Brian Palmer for the first time, right here in this room, where he sat here 8 years ago and shared with us some of the issues that you saw on screen yesterday in full disclosure around what to include and what to omit and how to tell that story. And as I said, Lindsay, it turns out I've known for 14 years, and we met in September 2001. So once again, things start in September 2001. A lot goes back to that month and time. So that's the human capital you'll be getting today. But as I said, because this is a public event and we are streaming it, and the speakers have all agreed to be recorded. So I need to thank the people who've made this all possible, the tireless Ellen White and Kelsey Powell in the events office here at Watson, John Mazza and Alex Laferriere for technical support here, Oscar Dupuis-Danjac, who I realize I've never said his last name before, who is the current TA for the class, and as you all know, is completely fantastic. The Dean of the College has supported a lot of the pieces that make this class possible, especially through support from the Jeffrey and Connie Tarrant Fund. Rick Locke and Lindsay Richardson, obviously, for the different flavors of commitment and passion they bring to the class. But especially, Jury Ketten and Alex Braunstein at the Swearer Center. Jury for the help she's given us in making connections with community organizations to make these films possible. But especially, I want to thank you guys, the students in this class right now, and especially those of the 35 of you who are actually here in this room. So thank you for being here. We built this for you. But it only has life because you show up and you throw yourself into it. So thank you for doing that. So that's the introduction. And now the most important and brief introduction. I want to introduce Brian Palmer. His biography is available to you. There's a sheet outside. If we need more copies, we can get them. And you can learn about his career track and some of his current projects, as well as information on the other speakers. So I won't be doing long, detailed introductions. We're very grateful that he accepted the invitation to come up from Richmond, where he's now based, to screen full disclosure, and take some questions last night. And so I'm really looking forward to extending that conversation and starting some new ones with his keynote this morning, Full Disclosure in Context. So please join me in welcoming Brian Palmer.
How many of you folks were not here last night? Okay, now I just want to get a sense of who's seeing what, because it may dictate what I show today.
I think a lot of people saw it online, though.
Yeah, that's good. It's fairly remarkable to be back here at Brown. I graduated in 1986, so that's a while ago. And walking up and down streets I haven't walked in quite a long time is quite special. And running into the professor who transformed my Brown experience crossing Thayer Street 12 minutes ago was pretty amazing. Has anyone had Anani DeGenio? So you know. Sort of asking myself, why didn't I call him before I came here? You know, it's that professor, so I have to examine that. But he knows I'm here, and I'm going to call him before I come the next time. So we had some amazing conversations last night after the talk, and I thank you for those questions. You made me think in ways that kept me up for some time. Thank you. And you don't have the context that we established at dinner afterwards. We had some other amazing conversations, so I'm hoping that these folks will help us continue that. But one place that I'd like to start now, and just put it out there, put it into the room, is this issue of privilege. So here we are at Brown University, and we are in a room with not a lot of people of color. We are dealing with our own issues of class, race, whatever, and I would like you to write down or text down just the word privilege, because when I talk to students about it, in the old days, I think I probably wielded it like a weapon, like, oh, you're privileged and I'm not, or someone is. And over the years, I've looked at my own privilege. Oh, snap, like I have privilege. And I've tried to figure out how to use it as a force for good. So how can you use your privilege, whatever it is? It may not be your skin color, it may not be your income, it may be something, but how can you use your privilege as something that can bring you closer to people, that can bring you deeper into your work and not remove you from things? So think about that carefully. Has anyone seen the TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie, Ngozi Adichie, The Danger of a Single Story? Who hasn't seen that? Okay, go talk to someone who's seen it. She has a phrase called that she uses about the balance of stories. So this is a Nigerian woman of a particular class who comes to the U.S. What she does is essentially say, okay, so there's this black-white dichotomy we all know about, we're familiar with, but then she talks about the dichotomies that she dealt with growing up in Nigeria, the class dichotomy, and having the story of someone with less privilege in her own society, that single story told about that person. He's poor. And then going to his house, to his village, and seeing he is so much more than he is poor. That single story, stereotyped and defined. But in her seeing that, and then in Chimamanda understanding in that, wow, like, I can also be a part of this process that reduces people to single stories. That ain't good. And as storytellers, we have the power to contribute to that balance of stories. So that's one frame I want you to have there. And then the tension between process and product. As professionals, we know you got to get the product out into the world if you want to meet your deadline, if you want to eat, right? But what you're doing here, and what you'll do throughout your career, is to build a process of making your work that's ethical, evidence-based, evidence-based, connective, and I'd like to also, think it's kind of humble. I think that to make work, you'll need to expose yourself in a certain way, in a healthy way, to people. You'll need to investigate your biases. All these things I know you are doing in your work now, but I just want to frame my work in that context because I did not have this experience at Brown. I graduated with a degree in East Asian area studies, so I just kind of put stuff together. Interdisciplinary stuff is great, but the experiences that I had that were kind of synthetic happened in classrooms with people like Anani, who allowed me to be vulnerable as a public high school kid who, first time going to school with prep school kids who know shit, like they just knew shit I did not know and knew how to present themselves in ways that I did not know. But in his classroom, he was able to draw us out. He was able to let us be vulnerable, but also to challenge us. And that was the key. There was no right answer to how to be in his class, but he had a realistic standard, I think, which changed and adapted for each of us that necessitated him seeing who we were. So I thought that was very powerful. So I'll give you a quick trip through my path from Brown. Is there a way to bring down these lights up front? So graduated in '86. do tour guides still walk backwards here?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah, we're trying to
so
change
my last summer round, do we have a tour guide here?
that. I coordinate the program, yeah.
Okay, so I was good. So I was a tour guide for the admission office, and one of my last times doing a tour, I encountered a Taiwanese lawyer and his wife and son, and they were here looking at schools, and we just started talking, and it turned out that he had a giant law firm. I didn't know how giant in Taiwan. I wound up in Taiwan as a legal proofreader after graduating from Brown, and let me tell you, at Brown I was a security guard, I was a janitor, and these were so much more exciting than being a legal proofreader. But that got me to Taiwan, and it also got me to realize I didn't really want to be a lawyer. But I was able to begin to build on things that I'd done at Brown, decent Chinese, not fabulous Chinese, so that when I got to grad school and Tiananmen happened, June 4, 1989, or the build-up to the Beijing Spring movement, I knew that things in China were happening that were just epical, that were amazing, because I studied in Nanjing, again, through Brown, had my world rocked, 1984-85, when all of the changes that made China what it is now were codified while I was there. So this idea that China would open to the market, that there were these economic experiments, economic reform, like all of that had been going on before 1984. It had started under Deng Xiaoping, and he put the stamp on it when we were there as 19-year-olds. So it was pretty amazing. So I knew in 1989 something magical was happening. I didn't have money to go. I was in grad school getting an MFA, but I knew that I wanted to go. So I, over a period of months, got some people to give me some money and paired up with someone who I met in Nanjing 4 or 5 years before that. And we traveled from Hong Kong north to Shanghai and finally to Beijing. And I'm thinking about the heroic individualism thing. That's something to kind of think about throughout this. I think there was a certain maybe heroic individualistic impulse going through what we were doing, which I don't think is entirely healthy. I think it can be a vehicle to get stuff out in the world, but there was also this real desire to understand. There's a real desire to understand what was going on. So in this particular picture, we had been kind of wandering around Beijing. This is, I think, October 1989. So the killing, most of it had already happened, not just in Beijing, but in other cities. These were soldiers who were brought into Beijing as part of the martial law force. So they were brought in from areas outside of Beijing, mostly rural folks, pitted against urban folks. And they were told that these urban folks, these students, the people supporting them were counter-revolutionaries, and they're trying to bring down China as we know it. So they were playing class against class, and that may have exacerbated and accelerated the crackdown. I didn't take a huge number of pictures, and I didn't take a lot of pictures head-on because people did not want to talk to us. If you were a foreigner, an obvious foreigner, I do not, I would sometimes joke I'm from Xinjiang province, I'm from the south of China, and people wouldn't really laugh because to talk to a foreigner was just really dangerous. The public security apparatus was rounding people up who may possibly have participated in the Beijing Spring movement. So we didn't get to talk to a lot of people, but I took a chance as we were walking through the Xizhimen, which is a transportation hub. I raised my little Nikon and took one frame, and then this soldier guy was like pointing and saying something like, "You might not want to do that." So I put the camera down, and he was pointing to a rooftop behind him where an officer type, you can tell he's an officer because he has that officer-y kind of cap, and another guy with binoculars were staring at us from a rooftop. And when I say a rooftop, I mean like an 18-story building behind. We could see them. So I assume there was a sniper there, and I'm sure that if we had persisted, some problems would have developed. But instead, since I put the camera down, he asked to take a picture with us. So Rob and I are in this picture with these guys who may have killed students from Beijing University in various places. So sort of interesting. But we wandered around. We did a video. We made pictures to the best of our ability. And I brought that back and turned it into a thesis project. I graduated from SVA in 1990 with an MFA. While I was doing that, I was working as a street photographer at the Village Voice. I mentioned to some of you folks, I was documenting ACT UP. I was breaking into journalism in a really interesting way. I didn't study journalism. I didn't really do much journalistic stuff here. I knew I wanted to take pictures, so I tried to get a job at the Village Voice as a photographer. And I showed them my portfolio, and it was one of those things where it was like, and then slide it across the table and thank you very much. Partly because my work wasn't ready, and partly because I don't think the photo editor liked me. But the first part was under my control. The work wasn't ready. So I actually got a job as a fact checker, and that's how I became a journalist, and that's how I think I became the journalist that I am now. Because while the expressive parts of things and the being the first and being timely and being dynamic and all that sort of stuff, yeah, but it's got to be right. Like the first thing that you go for, the first thing that you try and do is to be accurate and to be right. So, but I also was drawn to conflict. So, late 80s. Series of attacks on African American men who ventured into largely white neighborhoods. Al Sharpton would then, of course, lead a march into that neighborhood, and there would be a response from individuals such as this: "Hey, nigga, go home. Hey, this is what you came here for," kind of thing. And then the Crown Heights unrest, riots, melees, whatever. Have you studied or talked about that at all? It was a very sort of interesting explosion of ethnic, racial, class tensions between Orthodox Jews and and Americans of West Indian descent. And there was a police crackdown on it. It was sort of a very interesting time to be in New York. But I was gravitating toward that sort of conflict. I was also gravitating toward the sort of larger geopolitical stage. These are images shot after the first Gulf War. And then as it was going on, I did not go to Iraq for the first Gulf War. Again, I didn't have money, but I also wanted to document the war from here. And this is a funeral for Private Robert Talley, a young African-American man among the first killed in the Gulf War by friendly fire. So automatically sort of questioning that narrative that we were seeing in other media outlets. There was a lot of reporting on the weapons systems, and this is the weapons system that's going to be employed and all that other sort of stuff. Sanitized war and all the things that you're probably talking about in the context of drones now. So going from being that kind of scrappy, alternative journalist where the lines between what some would call advocacy and journalism were not entirely clear. So I was participating in an ACT UP rally. I was actually a member of an affinity group during the City Hall, shut down City Hall demo, and I was taking pictures, and then I handed my camera off to someone and I got arrested. So that's where it's clearly advocacy. But there's another kind of advocacy. And here, and I alluded to this, so this is my cover picture. One of maybe a half dozen I had for U.S. News and World Report. So to go from being in, covering, getting bonked on the head by police in the city of New York, to have the U.S. military stop flight operations so we could get the helicopter just right so I could photograph their ship was kind of mind-blowing. also kind of addictive, too. And I think that kind of addiction can be corrosive to all of the things that I wanted to be and do as a journalist. And I think all of the types of inquiry that you're doing. I'm not saying U.S. News necessarily did bad, terrible, compromised work, but I'm saying that there are all kinds of advocacy, there are all kinds of embedding, and this was certainly one of those. So not only were flight ops stopped for me, but I was a member of the White House press corps, and we would go into an event. So Bill Clinton was always late, always late, and wherever he was, whether he was in Poland or whether he was in Paducah. So he would be scheduled to be at an event at 1 p.m. and he would show up at 2, and he'd bring us in tow. So we'd have a room of 1,000 or so people, and the local press jostling position, and then you'd have the National Press Corps stroll in, and they take us right to the front. And when you start to feel entitled to that, you know there's a problem, particularly when what you're doing is documenting political theater. So I took this picture to keep my head on straight, to remind myself that a front-end loader doesn't normally park on the White House lawn, and this little lawn protecto condom thing kind of gives life to the fact that this is political theater. This is a photo op with the microphones, press secretary Dee Dee Meyer standing there listening very closely to this reinventing government rap. And then, of course, the picture that we're supposed to take is, that one. And I'm sure I took it. I can't remember. But that speaks to the photo opportunity. That speaks to the fact that we are part of the photo opportunity. We're constructing the photo opportunity. And more than that, though, when Bill Clinton went to Hawaii to do, I think it was the 40th anniversary of the victory in the Pacific, I went before him as part of an advance team. So members of the press, selected members of the press, photographers, TV people, would go with the Office of Production, the White House Office of Production, and a Secret Service agent or two, and you would pre-deploy. You would go out and you'd look at all the venues, and we would play a role in the photo ops. So picture that, like Village Voice, like running around in the street and really priding myself on knowing that people were thinking I was an advocate, but taking photographs in a very journalistically sound way. Very journalistically sound. Getting my facts straight, my evidence straight, and then going into this where we don't tell people, right? You don't tell people. No one, Time, Newsweek, New York Times, don't tell people these things, that we helped set up those photo ops. And this is 20 some odd years ago. So that's when I just started to think about stuff. While I was still enjoying riding on Air Force One. Very much a fun thing. But again, I was not riding on Air Force One as Brian Palmer. I was the guy from U.S. News who takes the pictures that we need published, right? That's really who I was to the White House. I was not an independent journalist. I was nothing special. I was just the person who was participating in their system of photo illustration and photo documentation and political theater. That became hard to be a part of at a certain point, and I convinced U.S. News to send me to China, largely because there were rumors that Deng Xiaoping was on his deathbed. There's a big New York Times story about the supreme leader. Looks like he's on his last legs. So I convinced them to send me to China to kind of document that process. He didn't die then. This was 94, 95. But I did get to spend some time with the bureau chief, a wonderful woman named Susan Lawrence, brilliant linguist and researcher, historian. And it turns out that she wanted to transition out of her bureau chief position, and because of my brown education and my pretty decent Mandarin, we traveled and I could keep up with most conversations as long as they weren't talking about like agricultural price adjustments in Kierkegaard. I was good. I wound up as Beijing bureau chief. Again, though, think about it, like an amazing opportunity, and here I am in the context of a magazine favored by military officers and dentists. The focus of what we did largely were those kind of comparative stories. How is China doing things like the U.S.? Are they integrating fast enough? Are they allowing U.S. businesses in? Is there a level playing field? How many rich people are in the country? And for me to understand China, I needed to go out and speak to Chinese people, right? But that wasn't the frame that we were using. It was very much a U.S.-centric, China-refracted through our market lens. So on the weekends and when I didn't have to do what I was supposed to do, I would just wander the streets and I would try and respond to people and to situations that I thought they didn't necessarily illustrate any particular narrative of China, but they illustrated my encounters, or they quoted my encounters with people. And that to me was a very useful and perhaps a more long-lasting enterprise. So this is a winter swimmer, Dongyong, at Hohai. I won't linger on that picture. That's Afghanistan, 2002. So I went from U.S. News Beijing bureau chief, very interesting position. I left, I came back to the States, and I got somehow a job with Fortune magazine. So here I am again, this person with an outsider persona, but seeking the security of the inside, seeking the status of the inside, I have to be honest. So I took a job as a staff writer at Fortune, thinking that Fortune would allow me to write the things that I wanted to write about, and that didn't really work out so well. They wanted CEO profiles, and I wanted to write stories about how the CEOs were screwing people, and it doesn't work for Fortune. I mean, it's very, very, very naive, but I did it anyway. And from there, I went to CNN. Okay, so we're talking about privilege. My sister, a career TV producer, she was working at CNN as a senior producer on a morning show, and she stuck her foot in the door for me and said, I can get you an interview. Pretty cool. I thought, well, this print thing, I love print, but I see this internet web digital thing kind of coming up, and I thought maybe like moving pictures would be a useful thing to know about. I've never been an early adopter, but I did have the sense to know that moving pictures were kind of something I should understand. So I got the interview, and because they were expanding their political team at the time and hiring people, they hired me. I didn't get onto the political team. I was turned into a general correspondent. But I covered 9/11 for CNN. It was my day off. It was a Tuesday. It was a beautiful day like today. And I was going into the office on the Q train. Has anyone been on the Q train in New York? So there's that stretch where it goes over the river. And I was going in with my sister, and it was the summer of the shark attack stories. Like, every story was like, shark attack. It was just pathetic. And they had just hired a washed-up, that's not fair, a journalist who had had a very, very long career doing things that we didn't think were very CNN, because I was proud of what CNN International did. I was proud of the, we respond fast, we try and get to the facts. We're not so much, concerned with the, that kind of thing. That's changed. So I was, we were yapping and yapping and yapping on the train, and it's New York, everybody's loud, and then they weren't. And we looked, and there was this little burning hole in the World Trade Center, and it did not compute. It did not compute. So we chugged across the river, and when we got to Canal Street, I just jumped off the subway and ran south. And I got within a block of the towers, Century 21, if anyone had bought cheap clothing there. And my cell phone wasn't working, so I called the office and said, get a crew to me, come down to me. And they said, no, you need to go north to Foley Square because Rudy Giuliani is going to do a press conference. I said, that's crazy, I'll never get back down here. So I went north, and we set up in Foley Square. I found the crew, and that's when the towers came down. I had been part of a progressive photo agency in the late 80s, early 90s called Impact Visuals. And there was a very tough, scrappy, chain-smoking photographer named Bill Biggert who had been doing a long-term project on firefighters. And he went into the towers, and he was killed that day. If I had had my cameras, I would have gone into the towers as well, because I was there. They sent me to Afghanistan, and I talked about this last night. CNN was trying to keep the Bureau warm. You know, there wasn't really much rock'em sock'em news going on in this like early 2002, so January 2002 or so. But they wanted to keep the Bureau open, so they were cycling people through. I was not a superstar correspondent. I was just a general assignment guy, but they cycled me in, and I immediately thought this would be a great way to tell stories about what Afghanistan is. Not simply a country for which, in which we play out these geopolitical games, but who are the people? So these are some men going on the first Hajj after the collapse of, or the destruction of the regime. What year was this? 2002. And I wanted to do stories on people from different ethnic groups, but when it bleeds, it leads. You guys have heard that saying before in journalism. When bullets start flying, when people start getting injured, it doesn't really matter what the context is, you just have to follow that. So we threw that kind of reporting away and went immediately to the bleeding and the leading. It sort of turns out to be, this early part is like the story of Brian leaving a lot of jobs. But this was an amazing and tremendous education, realizing that I needed to look at my privilege, whatever that was, and I had to develop some self-awareness about how I kept finding myself in these jobs that I didn't really belong in. I wanted to tell stories, and I wanted to tell stories about real people, and I wanted to talk about social injustice and things like that. But I also wanted the status. I also wanted to be paid for what I did. I mean, I came out of Brown with some student loan debt, let me tell you. And then I went to graduate school, and bam, like that next layer. And I fought for scholarships. I did all that, and I got a little bitty bit. It still took me another, after a graduate degree, 10 years to pay off all of my student debt. So that was important to me. Where I came from, my family situation, like money was a thing. It was a thing that we had and then we didn't have. So both that status as an African American, being one of the few in the room, one of the few black photographers at the White House, the only, at the time, bureau chief in Beijing, all this, that kind of mattered too. But that was the sort of superficial facial stuff. What really mattered was the story. So after leaving U.S. News, CNN, I had a little money and I had a little momentum. So I decided I wanted to do some stories that I'd never been able to do before. I went to Burma. There was a political thaw at the time. I did a piece for Newsweek International. Political prisoners were being released slowly. Aung San Suu Kyi was not released from house arrest, but she was being allowed to go from her office to the NLD office, the office of her party. So I would just go there and wait and sit and talk to people and hope that the lady would come down the stairs and talk. And I thought I was real smooth. Again, thinking, here I am, I'm in Burma, and I'm on a tourist visa, and nobody knows who I am, this black guy in Rangoon, yeah. So I was talking to some guy who was sitting next to me. I said, how come there's no surveillance? So it's like, again, he kind of looks at me like, are you high or just American? So he sort of, there's a big open doorway, and he leans over and he points out at some dudes sitting on a bench in a park. He said, that's military intelligence. They got the lungis and everything, but so they know exactly who you are and what you're doing. So, I was still working on that naivete thing. I told part of this story last night. So, after Afghanistan, after a particular incident where I was doing live shot after live shot about a particular, I didn't talk about this last night, I just referred to it. Operation Anaconda. Seymour Hersh writes quite a bit about it. Sean Naylor writes about it. Engagement between U.S. Special Forces, Taliban, Al-Qaeda. We, as in CNN, were getting reports from various directions. Afghan Ministry of Intelligence, Afghan Ministry of Defense, and the U.S. military. So the U.S. military, that's who my editors, producers wanted to go with. And they were giving us rosy accounts of what was going on. I asked a couple of challenging questions, and we hear that that coalition forces actually bombed our own troops, and they retreated. And I can't remember the answer, but it was not yes, which would have been the truth. It was something that fell quite short of yes. So I said what the U.S. military was saying on camera to several million people. And then I get back, and I read Cy Hersh's book. You guys know, you all know Seymour Hersh, right? My Lai Massacre, Chain of Command. Seymour Hersh, he's one of the reasons I became a journalist. I saw him talk when I was a high school junior and thought, wow, because he didn't expose the My Lai Massacre, but he expanded that story. So I had become something very, very different by the time I was at CNN. I think I did some good work, but I'd been put in a position where my values had been tested and I thought I failed. I asked hard questions, but I was in front of the camera and I was not playing my role as someone who spoke truth to power. I was, in a sense, a stenographer, as Eric Barsamian's term is, a stenographer to power. Come back home, read Cy Hersh's work, I read Sean Naylor's work, and I think, who am I? What role am I playing? This is not just heroic individualism. This is not just Brian's career. This is dead people. The stakes are so tremendously high if we take what we do seriously. If we take the connections that we make with the people we interview seriously. If we don't just take their stories and move away and go on to the next challenge, the next story, but if those stories stay with you, then you have a responsibility to do something. So I used my privilege, as I said last night, to call up a three-star general who I met while I was the photographer taking those aircraft carrier pictures. We had formed a relationship. It's very, very weird, but when he was a colonel of Marines, which is something that's important, I spent a lot of time with his troops on ships. And he's a very, very savvy man, and he could see that, I was really kind of getting into it. And he said, son, you'd make a fine Marine. So, of course, I was completely flattered. This is like a progressive guy who was a member of ACT UP, who was like, so already there are some challenges of embedding, right, going on there. But my head was straight enough to make that call and to get another interview, another audition with the public affairs officer for the 24th Marine Expeditionary Unit. I showed up with a full pack and thinking that I either get to go to Iraq if they think I'm kosher or I don't. So I wrote that, and it's again maybe a little naive, but also very true. I knew what I was doing to a large degree. There was some unexamined stuff, which I also talked about last night, unexampled stuff about machismo, but there was examined stuff as well. I was 39 when I first went over, and I knew. I'd been part of the Department of Defense pool. I knew that it was the Pentagon's job to keep their enemies, their friends close, but their enemies, or their potential enemies in the press, closer. That's what embedding, the media embedding program, is about. They can, it's not so much that they need to manage information, they just get you nice and close, they feed you, they keep you alive, you're just hanging out, and you kind of lean over eventually, right? To some degree. I started off on the wrong foot with them, which I'm proud of. The first story I did was on a group of goth Marines. Who knew that there were goth Marines like Charles Pearson, Wiccans, and folks who resisted and rebelled the cultural strictures within the Marine Corps. When they were in garrison and when they were in formation, they were Marines. But when they were off base and at Carpe Noctem, they were these like hard guys were like, it was trans, it was queer, it was Wiccan, it was crazy, and it was beautiful. And the public affairs officer, he said, you know, was this the first story you had to publish about the Marine Corps? That almost kept me off the plane. But it also kept me real, because that was a part of the story that I found incredibly compelling. I gravitate toward particular things, obviously. I talk about my naivete, and I can be self-deprecating and all that sort of stuff. But I see things, and I follow them: race, racial segregation, conflict, power. There's stuff that's I wasn't so self-aware about, the macho stuff, but that's part of the story that I tell about being in Iraq. I knew that most of the time I would be among U.S. Marines, but I also knew that when I came into contact with Iraqi people, I had to show what it meant for Iraqi civilians to be in contact with U.S. military personnel. Now, when you embed, you get really close to people, but if you're a thinking person and a feeling person, you can break through that process over time, which I did. And that's when I realized that I will always have this two-ness when I cover these guys, like the guy on the right. I will have compassion for them, certainly, but I can never, ever forget that when they leave the wire, they are representatives of enforcers, representatives of the United States. They are implementers of foreign policy with the license to kill, and they don't always know who to kill. Sometimes killing is not what one should be thinking. They are hammers in a landscape of eggs and oranges and nails that they can't even find. But the point is, if you're a hammer, what do you know but nails? So I try to come to people with sensitivity. These are hospital guards outside of Musaib Hospital, checkpoint. An Iraqi sheikh has to come into the U.S. base, which was co-located with a power plant, in order to get his weapons permits stamped. And then on the right, these were people suspected of taking part in attacks on U.S. coalition forces on forward operating base. Time, okay. I thought I'd be swifter than this.
No, I'm asking how you
Give me 3 minutes. So, Iraq. We talked about that last night. I talked about the things that were sobering. So, the macho, here I am covering a war, and isn't that really cool? The things that truly challenged, evaporated that cool were the things that war is about. War is about death. It is about destruction, and it is a force that continues of its own momentum once it started. So I found that the antidote to getting lost in the heroic stuff was to deal with the mortality, and was to deal with the people who were killed and the ones that were left behind. That's how I avoided getting sucked up into this idea that I could just keep going back. So this is Sergeant Edgar Lopez. He was killed in 2004. I had just left my embed. It was my first one. I was flying out of the country. I wasn't flying yet. I was stuck at an air base. He had been killed in, I think, a mortar attack. And I got home, found out only then, and decided I wanted to go to his wife's home and interview her and her children. After Iraq, I was trying to put everything together. I was trying to understand what I saw. I was trying to confront the limitations of what I was doing. Before I finished the documentary, which I tried to wrap my hands around all of the things that I was doing. So I just wrote, I wrote some things that were rather opinionated and got me in trouble with colleagues, but I had to do it at that time. I made, full disclosure, you don't need to see that now, you saw that already. And this is where this project sort of ends. It ends with me in Arlington Cemetery, kind of wandering around, taking pictures, and hearing gunshots, a salute to men who had just been buried, walking in that direction, seeing this grave, and then seeing these other graves of young men who were in the unit that I deployed with. So that was sort of eerie. So I spent a lot of time doing stories about destruction and war and death and putting the film together. It took a number of years. I didn't finish until 2009, and I was sort of at a loss for what to do then. But I was doing my thing. My dad died in 2011. As I was going through his stuff with my wife, she found this picture of 9 old black people behind that grave, one of whom was my father. So I barely recognized that name, Matthew Palmer. I knew it was my great-grandfather, but I knew nothing else. If you look at the date, you can kind of figure out he was probably an enslaved person or a slave, but we call folks enslaved people. So that was kind of an interesting bit of knowledge. But what I knew also was that that grave is on a top-secret military base, which is also the farm. You guys know what the farm is? What's the farm? Anybody? Capital T, capital F. It's where the CIA trains. And that's not released, that's not information released by the CIA, that's information that journalists have discovered. So when I realized that my dad had gotten onto the base, I realized I could get onto the base. I was less interested in the connection to my roots, that sort of stuff. I wanted to have the bragging rights to say, oh yeah, I was on the CIA base. Yeah. But when I got there, something very, very different happened. I saw that grave. I saw the condition of the cemetery, which is not good. They took us across the base, for some reason, to the white cemetery. So this was actually a community that the Navy kicked out in 1942 and turned into a military base. 10,000 acres of land, mostly black people, some white people. And they just took the land, took everything on it, leveled pretty much everything except cemeteries and some of the white institutions. So they didn't destroy the white church, and they kept the white church in very, very good condition. Matt Palmer, I decided that I wanted to figure out who this man was. I wanted to tell the story of that community, because while the African American story of that community had pretty much been erased and that cemetery was allowed to decay, the white community's church was maintained as if it were 1942. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful place. I can't remember if I have a slide in there. And the unknown Confederate soldier's grave is also beautifully maintained, which kind of blew my mind, because this man, there's one picture of him in existence, had been a slave, had been a soldier in the Union Army, and his stuff had been allowed to decay. So I spent a lot of time at the church that he helped found, and I've gotten really deeply into how American history is remembered, how it divides us, how some narratives are erased and delegitimized, such as the entire story of the United States colored troops, and how certain aspects are fetishized and celebrated, the Confederate stuff. This image is from the Klan rally, the recent Klan rally in South Carolina. And then finally, the work that I'm doing now, because I don't have direct access to the cemetery at Camp Perry. I can't shoot there. I can't visit when I want to. My wife Erin and I wanted to visually depict a process of reclaiming African American history in a very hands-on kind of way. So we volunteer at a cemetery outside of Richmond, African American cemetery that has been allowed to decay. And every headstone that we reveal is an amazing connection to the past, to this past that Richmond doesn't really give a darn about, as we celebrate Jeb Stuart and Robert E. Lee. All of this stuff just kind of lies in the ground. Final image. This is the house that my great-grandfather's owner lived in. It's been, a lot of work has been done since 1860-something, when my great-grandfather would have been working this land, but that is the shell of the house that he would not have been allowed to enter. So we did research, found our way there, and that's kind of the pivotal point of the documentary I'm making called Make the Ground Talk. But in terms of how that applies to you all, in my work as a journalist, one of the continuums that I have to deal with and navigate is this kind of impulse to be literal, and then this need to be lyrical. Something that's so lyrical and so poetic that isn't grounded in the evidence, I can't do that. That's not what I do. And yet something that's so literal that you're just, it's like eating raw peas. I can't, I could do that, but I know that that does not reach people. It doesn't touch people. So I move along that continuum, and this is sort of an example of that. As an old school journalist, I would never have done that. And yet, here I am, part of the story, as I was in my documentary, but I think an organic part. I mean, and this is my last sentence. I had no history, really, before my visit to Camp Perry. African Americans have no history to a degree because the names of enslaved people were not usually recorded. But I've slowly reclaimed some of that history, and this is an example of that. There's such power in that. I'll stop there. You can tell me.
So let's do this stuff the next panel.
Oh, fine. Okay. What should we do?
Well, maybe you can take a couple of immediate questions that people immediately have, and
yes.
then we'll roll other sort of thoughts about this into the discussion later on. Is that good?
That's perfect.
So
immediately.
Anything that anyone, yeah.
I have a quick tech question for you. When did you switch to digital and why?
Wow, that's a great question. I will be succinct. 2003 or 4, because I had no choice. At that time, you could shoot film if you were Jim Nachtwey, but if you were not, or the 7 people, I don't even know if 7 existed, but yeah. Certain people could shoot film because the New York Times and other people would they still had a boutique operation for them. If you were not them, it was expected that if you want to get published, you need to move stuff digitally, and then I just had to transition because that was it. Yeah. So 2003, 2004. Yeah. Yes.
What are your opinions of big news corporations like CNN and ABC and all those now, and how do you see them evolving?
It's a case-by-case thing. I was in a room a couple of weeks ago, conference on the future of photojournalism, and you had a lot of the older media represented there, the big multinationals. And one thing that seemed striking is that there was some people were still kind of in dinosaur mode, trying to figure out ways to hold on to their gatekeeper status. And other people were actually engaging in the world in a really aggressive and not necessarily avaricious sort of a way. So you had people who were trying to grapple with the fact that we're getting some amazing journalism from people who don't come through our system. The Instagrammer in Cairo, the photo agency in Dhaka, Bangladesh. How do we integrate as opposed to just absorb? So I think the people, the organizations that accept the fact that they no longer get to control what news is are doing a good thing. I think the ones who still pretend that they can are doing so at our peril. So I'm not going to name names, but I think that you can tell from the quality of the work, you can tell from the bylines, you can tell from all sorts of stuff who is actually doing the good thing. Anybody else? Okay.
Can we store the questions for the panel? Thank Brian again.
Thank you.